A debt crisis is threatening to take down the world's banking system. Again. This one, though, isn't accidental. It was caused on purpose. And that was done by the people who controlled the world's money supply. And they did it because those guys have a plan. I'm sure most of us can remember mid-2020, right when that contagion of fear was sweeping the world about just what it was which was going on with this virus that we'd suddenly encountered. It was an unknown threat, and that was what made it so terrifying for people. Now, during the first half of 2020, I think most people could have been forgiven for being alarmed because we didn't know what we were dealing with. As time went on, we came to see that it was no big deal. And what we could see is that the true contagion was fear. The pandemic was fear. And this is a pattern that we've seen again and again throughout our lives, and it happens far too often. Just in the last 25 years, we can see 9/11, for example, that stupefying moment when you saw the two planes take down the three buildings there in New York. And across the world, if you recall, there was just terror, fear everywhere. People didn't know what was going to happen next. And it was that element of the unknown which, of course, drives the pandemic of fear. After that, 7 years later, there was the global financial crisis. Again, terror, fear, sprung on the public. The banking system is about to go down. Taxpayers need to bail out the banking system to the tune of trillions of dollars. And we can all see the results of that. The rich have gotten richer. The poor have gotten poorer because all the money has gone into assets and has stripped wage earners and savers of their wealth. And all of these events, these terror events, we can see they don't happen accidentally. They're planned. The people in control of Western nations, they use terror as a primary weapon against the public. And they rely upon the public being ignorant, disorganized, and largely gullible for it to work. Because every single time one of these pandemic of fear events has occurred, we've seen new legislation which strips us of our liberties, new wars, new parts of an agenda which is obviously heading towards something which is very illiberal and very anti-human. Unfortunately, too many people are still plugged into the TV and they're unable to see it yet, but they will. Now, this current contagion of fear, this current wave of terror that we're seeing, it revolves around, of course, what started with Silicon Valley Bank. It was a bank which bought government debt at very low yields. They were getting low interest rates. And then as interest rates have been hiked up by the Federal Reserve, this bank was unable to pay the interest on deposits that the depositors at the bank needed. As word got out, then that caused a panic, a run on the bank, and this has led to the beginnings of a contagion, which has now gone global. Now, every single stage of this was caused by the United States Federal Reserve Bank, which is not federal, has no reserves, and is not a bank. The Fed, after 9/11, pushed rates far too low for too long. This led to a bubble in housing, particularly in the United States. Then, into 2007, the Fed hiked rates. And as they did that, that put people underwater and the global financial crisis was triggered. Now, after the GFC, the Fed then pushed interest rates far lower than they'd ever been before. In fact, interest rates for the best part of 15 years were around zero, which has never before happened in 6,000 years of recorded human history. And this radical agenda, it's not an experiment either, because these people know what they're doing. This radical agenda, which was copied by central banks all around the world who follow the Fed's lead, has created now the biggest debt bubble which has ever been known in all of human history. There has never been a debt bubble like we see on the planet today. Now that the planet is absolutely, totally saturated in debt due to this pushing of ultra-low interest rates down to the floor, into this debt bubble, the Fed then decided this year to hike interest rates at the fastest rate in all of history. The Fed has never hiked as quickly as they're hiking now. And they're hiking when the United States government, for example, has over $30 trillion in debt. And that's not even considering the private debt and the other global sovereign debt around the planet. The Fed intentionally caused this debt crisis. They blew the bubble up in the first place, got everybody hooked on enormous amounts of unpayable debt, and then now they've pulled out a pin and they've popped the bubble. And now that they've done it, the whole planet is about to experience a catastrophic deflationary wave, which will probably go on for a very long time. Okay, so why? Why are we about to see businesses go under? People lining up at ATMs in fear? Why are we about to see people lose everything in this catastrophic deflationary wave? Well, the answer is because our entire economic system is built on debt. All our lives, we've been told by the TV, the experts, all the people in charge, that the reason that particularly people in the West have this enormously extravagant standard of living, the reason that we live in this material utopia that we do, well, of course, the cultural Marxists say it's privilege and racism, but they're morons. But the experts would tell us it's because we're all just really productive and really smart and really clever, and that's why we've got these wonderful things. It's not true. The reason we've all lived in such a material utopia is because of debt. We have a debt-based money creation system, and this has meant that we've been leveraging and leveraging and leveraging against the future. Debt is wealth pulled from the future and consumed in the present. And we became experts at pulling forward all of the wealth that we could from the future and consuming it in what is now the past. Eventually, when you do that, the Austrian School of Economics tells us this, you will reach a point where you can't keep adding to the debt, and you have a moment where it all unwinds and you get the people jumping out of buildings on Wall Street in 1929 type situation. We're now very close to that point, and all of it has been caused by the central banks. So if we're going to get a handle on what we're about to experience, we need to understand, who are the central banks? What are these things? And I'm making the case in this video that the central banks are not really in charge. The central banks are shop fronts, and they're shop fronts for the money power. There is a cabal of oligarchs who control the central banking system. They control the big banks. They control everything about the economy, and they are the ones who decided that it was time to pull the pin on the rest of humanity. Now, that's a big statement, I know. So let me explain what I mean by the money power. And I'm going to talk about the three pillars of their power: central banks, the big international Wall Street banks, and the private investment funds. I'm going to go through each. So first, let's talk about the central banks. Look, the central banking system is the system which oversees currency and money creation and also interest rate controls. And so they oversee money. If you didn't know, look at the currency notes, if you can get a hold of any by now. It depends when you're watching this video. And have a look and see who the issuing authority is. And you'll notice it's not your legislature, your president, your prime minister, your king or queen, whatever. It's your central bank. They're the issuing authority for currency. And the central banks play the key role in the boom-bust economic cycle, because they control interest rates. And when you have a monetary system where 90% of the world's currency is created via debt, then when you are the person who sets the price for debt, which central banks do, you have total economic control. This is total ownership of people through stealth. And it's something that isn't understood by people because it's complex and it works in ways that they're not intuitive to everyday people. You really have to want to know this to find it out. The next pillar of the money power's power is the systemically important financial institutions. These are the too big to fail Wall Street banks, or the too rich to jail banks, sort of JP Morgan, Citibank, Bank of America, the big names there on Wall Street. Now, the central banks around the world, quite a few of them are controlled, or well, let's say are statutory authorities. So in Australia, the Reserve Bank is not privately owned. The Reserve Bank is a statutory authority and it's essentially a bureaucracy. But the bank that matters the most is the Federal Reserve. It's the central bank of the planet because the United States is the economic capital of the world. And the Federal Reserve System is not public, it's private. There are shareholders in the Federal Reserve System and no one knows who they are. And because of that, it means that we can be absolutely guaranteed that the same people who own controlling stakes in all of those too big to fail banks, they're the ones who are the shareholders. They're the owners and controllers of the central banking system. And those people also own the private investment companies like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. Now, if you want to check this out, go on Yahoo Finance and pick any large publicly listed company you can think of. Look at who the shareholders are, the majority shareholders, and you will see time and time and time again, every single time, it's BlackRock, it's Vanguard, it's State Street. And these are called private investment funds or equity funds, that type of thing, and we don't know who owns them and who controls them. It's the same people who control the central banking system and the too big to fail banks. It's all the same people. They're the money power. They're the ones in charge, and they're the ones who are engineering this crisis we're headed into. It's an oligarchy. We don't live in a democracy. We don't live in some sort of egalitarian society where the will of the people is expressed in politics and all that stuff you get taught in school, if they even teach it anymore. No, we live in an oligarchy. And the money power, the people who are in charge of the world's finances, they use their financial power to control the private sector. They control politics. They control the media. They control entertainment. They control judicial appointments, research grants, academia, the deep state, all of it. Because if you control the money, you control the world. Every lever of power on the planet, well, particularly within the West, let's say, because I don't know that they've got the same level of power outside of the West. Maybe we'll find out soon enough. But certainly within Western countries, every lever of power is controlled by the money power. These people are the ones driving the agenda into World War III, because they've got a plan for a post-World War III New World Order of total power. This is the whole Great Reset palaver. You'll own nothing and you'll shut up about it or you'll disappear. That's the system that's going to be brought in on the other side of a catastrophic war, which these people are hoping will demilitarize governments and bring the entire world under the authority of something like the UN. I know it's going to sound out there if you haven't looked into it, but they've written books about it. They talk openly about it because they know most normies are just totally not going to even listen. You could tell, what does Yuri Bezmenov says, once someone has been demoralized, you can put the truth in their face and they still will reject it. We've reached that status as society. So most people would reject that statement that I just made there, but it's totally true. And the money power, they don't need to control too many people. They just need reliable servants in critical positions. For example, people like Christine Lagarde, right? This woman, she's a lawyer, but she was the head of the IMF when crucial decisions needed to be made in ways that benefited the money power during the European debt crisis. Then she got parachuted over to the European Central Bank when the interest rates needed to be kept artificially low. She has served her masters well, and she, of course, has been well remunerated. Another one in Europe is Mario Draghi. He was the governor of the Italian Central Bank, and then he must have pleased the oligarchs. He pleased the money power. He got made the head of the ECB after Lagarde, and he carried on with do whatever it takes policies which push interest rates actually into negative territory at that point, and just set the stage for a catastrophic economic situation in Europe, which is going to really burn the people who are there, unfortunately. And then after that, he was the Prime Minister of Italy for 18 months. You can see these people, they move from position to position because they are total slaves to the money power. They are servants of the money power, and so they get rewarded. And of course, in the United States, we've got Janet Yellen, who was the head of the Fed. She's an academic. She was made head of the Fed, and she kept interest rates pushed artificially low while this debt bubble was getting to its gigantic, catastrophic proportions. And then after that, she gets made US Secretary of the Treasury in the Biden administration. So Janet Yellen is there to make sure the money power gets key decisions made the way that it wants at key moments, because that's all you need to stay in charge. And the agenda which is being pushed out by people like Janet Yellen, where all of this is headed financially, as the private banking system may be totally demolished. We're yet to see if they're going to allow even the major big banks on Wall Street to go down, and they might. But if they do, it's all about bringing in central bank digital currencies. Now, I can't explain central bank digital currencies better than Catherine Austin Fitts. She's brilliant on the topic. And so here's her on Tucker laying it all out.
So Tucker, the one of the bedrocks of freedom is freedom to do financial transactions, including privately, or freedom to do where you want to do and wherever you want to do. And unfortunately, as the financial system has become more and more digital, you see more and more not only invasive surveillance, but more and more controls. You referred to Canada, perfect example. And the reality, as the financial system gets more controlling and more invasive, it's a little bit like bringing up a corral around us. And CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, and vaccine passports or digital IDs are sort of the last shutting of the gate. It's hard for many people to imagine the risks here because we're so used to living with financial transaction freedom, and we don't understand that when this gate closes on us, we literally will be sitting in a system where the central banks believe that our assets belong to them, and they can dictate where we can spend money and what we can spend money on. The important thing to understand is central bank digital currencies are not currencies. It's a financial transaction control grid, and it gives the ability for the central bankers, and they've said this publicly, the ability to not only set the rules centrally, but enforce the rules centrally. If you don't behave, you can have your money turned off.
The rights and liberties that people in the Western liberal democracies were accustomed to have been steadily erased, and it's been hard to pin down who's behind it. We see figures like Gates with the pandemic and whatnot, but he's just one player. And you might think, as we head into this financial crisis, that it's the central banks that are in charge. But I don't believe that's the case. There's a power behind the central banks. It's the money power. It's the oligarchs who have been in charge for a very long time, but are now beginning to step out more publicly into the open and take control more fully. This has been a very long developed plan. They've been talking about it for a very, very long time. And these are the people who prop up people like Klaus Schwab. They're the people who fund the selections that we think are elections. These are the people behind it. The money power rules via fear and terror. We saw that with 9/11. We saw that with the global financial crisis. We saw it with COVID. And now we're seeing it with this banking crisis. And it leads us to a question which we're going to have to grapple with as we head into the more of what might end up being the most critical and crucial phase of this steady destruction of what we've considered to be Western civilization and its replacement with something else. What do you do when the worst terrorists in the world are the people running it?